The moon hung high in the sky, casting its silver light over the rolling hills of the farm. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant croak of a frog by the pond. The only sounds that truly mattered were the steady breathing of the animals nestled in their pens and the soft shuffle of paws on the ground. Duke, the farm's loyal guard dog, sat at the edge of the pasture, his eyes scanning the darkness. His coat, thick and dense from years of working the fields, blended seamlessly with the shadows. His muzzle was graying, a sign of age, but his senses were as sharp as ever. The barn and the fencing were quiet, but Duke knew that calm could be a facade. The flock of sheep, safely huddled in their pen, trusted Duke with their lives. They had known him for years, and he had always kept them safe. He was more than just a dog to them. He was their protector, their shield against the dangers that roamed the night. Tonight, though, there was an unease in the air. Duke could feel it. His nose twitched at the breeze, picking up the faintest scent of something foreign, something dangerous. Coyotes. Duke's ears flicked back, and he rose from his resting spot, his muscles coiling like a spring, his eyes locked on the distant line of trees, where the shadows seemed to grow darker and thicker, as if something was moving just beyond the edge of the farm's fence. The coyotes were out there. He could feel their presence, a quiet, predatory energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. They were smart, patient hunters, always looking for an opportunity to strike. But Duke had been trained for this. He had been guarding the flock for years, keeping predators at bay. He knew what he had to do. With a low growl rumbling in his chest, Duke trotted over to the pen where the sheep were resting, his tail held low but steady. The sheep were oblivious to the danger, but Duke wasn't. His gaze swept over them, counting, each one to make sure they were all there. Everything seemed in order, but he could still sense the threat lurking in the darkness. He circled the pen, making sure the gate was secure, and then took up his position by the fence where he could see the trees. He would wait. Coyotes were opportunists. They would come when the time was right. The minutes stretched on. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the predators. Duke's muscles tightened as he heard the faintest rustle in the brush. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the movement. A coyote, alone, was creeping toward the edge of the pasture, its coat blending with the night. Duke's teeth bared, but he didn't move. Not yet. Patience was key. The coyote wasn't close enough yet. The rustling grew louder, more distinct. Duke's gaze flicked back to the pen, checking on the sheep once more. They were still unaware, still resting. He couldn't let them be caught off guard. The coyote, emboldened by the absence of immediate danger, edged closer to the flock, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It was only a matter of time before the others would follow. Duke's instincts kicked into overdrive. He barked once, low and commanding, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. The coyote froze, its ears flattening against its head. Duke's bark was not just a warning to the coyote. It was a signal to the entire pack. A lone wolf was no match for a dog who knew the land and his flock. Duke waited, every sense alert, his gaze never leaving the trees. He could hear the soft shuffle of paws, distant, but getting closer. The pack was moving in. The first coyote, still hesitant, backed away slightly, but it didn't retreat. It was just waiting, calculating its next move. Duke could feel the tension building as the night seemed to hold its breath. He barked again, louder this time, sending a message. This is my land, my flock, "Leave now, or face me." The coyote didn't move, but Duke could hear the pack's growls, low and menacing, coming from the trees. The coyotes were getting braver. They had smelled blood, and they were hungry. Duke's eyes narrowed. He was ready. The sheep were counting on him. Without warning, the coyotes broke from the trees, charging in a coordinated assault toward the pen. Duke's heart pounded, but he didn't hesitate. He sprang into action, his body a blur of motion as he rushed to intercept them. The first coyote lunged, but Duke was quicker. With a powerful snarl, he bit down on its flank, forcing it back. Coyotes scattered for a moment, but they regrouped quickly. They were more than just scavengers. They were skilled hunters, and they wouldn't give up so easily. Duke stood his ground, keeping his position between the pack and the sheep. He wasn't just protecting his flock now. He was fighting for survival. The coyotes circled, growling, looking for an opening. Duke's body was tense, every muscle screaming with the effort to stay alert. Another coyote lunged, and Duke met it head-on, the two colliding in a spray of dust and fur. The coyote's teeth scraped across his coat, but Duke was relentless, using his weight and strength to overpower it. The coyotes growled, retreating momentarily as Duke stood firm, his eyes glowing in the moonlight. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. The pack hesitated, sensing that they were facing a formidable opponent. They circled warily, watching for an opening. But Duke had one thing the coyotes didn't. He had the loyalty and strength to fight for those he loved. The coyotes, after a long moment of tension, seemed to realize that the risk was too great. With a final growl, they retreated, melting back into the shadows of the trees, their hunger unsatisfied for now. Duke stood still, watching them disappear into the night. His chest heaved with heavy breaths, his body bruised and tired from the struggle. But he didn't move. Not yet. It wasn't until the last echo of the coyote's retreat faded into the distance that he finally relaxed, his body sinking onto the ground. His eyes turned toward the sheep, who were still huddled in the pen, unaware of how close they had come to danger. Duke let out a slow breath, his body aching, but his heart content. The night had been long, but his flock was safe. For tonight, at least. The night had passed in tense silence, but Duke knew it wasn't over. His paws were sore, his muscles aching from the constant vigilance. He had fought hard, but the coyotes were cunning, and he could feel in his bones that they wouldn't stop. The attack had been a warning, one that Duke had no intention of ignoring. The morning sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The birds started their songs, the world awakening to a new day. But Duke stayed by the pen, his eyes scanning the horizon, unwilling to relax. He could hear the sheep stirring inside the pen, their soft bleats breaking the quiet of the morning. They were safe for now, but Duke's instincts told him that the coyotes would return. They had been too close to the farm, too interested in the flock. They were hungry, and Duke knew they would try again. He turned his gaze toward the trees that bordered the pasture. The wind was still, the air crisp with the chill of early spring. There was no sign of movement, but Duke wasn't fooled. The coyotes had been here once, and they would be back. His ears perked up as a rustling sound came from the brush, far off but distinct. Duke's body tensed, ready for whatever came next. He had been in this position before. and he knew that the best way to deal with a threat was to stay calm, stay focused. A single coyote appeared at the edge of the woods, its sleek coat blending with the shadows. It was thinner than Duke, leaner, its eyes bright with hunger. The coyote paused for a moment, its gaze locking onto Duke's. There was no fear in the coyote's eyes, only a calculated hunger. It had been testing Duke last night, learning his movements, assessing his strength. The coyote took a step forward, then another, its body low to the ground, as if preparing to spring. Duke growled low in his throat, a sound that was both a warning and a challenge. He would not let this creature near the flock. The coyote stopped, its ears flicking as it listened. Duke's growl deepened, and the coyote seemed to hesitate for just a moment. It wasn't sure how to approach, whether to retreat or to try again. But then, as if it had made up its mind, the coyote darted forward, its speed a blur in the early morning light. Duke lunged into action, a blur of muscle and fur, cutting off the coyote's path before it could reach the sheep. The two collided, with a force that sent the ground shaking beneath them. Teeth snapped, claws scraped, and Duke fought with everything he had. His job was clear: keep the flock safe, no matter the cost. The coyote snarled, trying to dodge Duke's grip, but Duke was quicker, stronger. He grabbed the coyote by the scruff of its neck, his powerful jaws locking down. With a sharp shake, he sent the animal tumbling away. The coyote yelped, a sound of surprise and pain, and it scrambled to regain its footing. Duke's hackles stood on end as the coyote, now injured, backed away. He could see the pack gathering in the trees, their eyes glowing in the shadows. They weren't going to let this go. They would fight for the sheep, and Duke would fight just as fiercely for them. The coyote growled, its eyes never leaving Duke's, before it retreated back into the forest, no longer willing to risk the fight. But Duke didn't let his guard down. He knew this was only the beginning. As the pack pulled back into the woods, Duke stood his ground, his body tense and ready. The coyotes weren't gone for good. They had tasted the sheep's scent, and they were determined to return. He took a deep breath and glanced at the pen, where the sheep were now fully awake, bleating softly in confusion. They hadn't witnessed the fight, but Duke knew they could feel the tension in the air. He walked to the pen, checking each of the sheep with a steady gaze, making sure they were all accounted for. He could see the nervous energy in some of them, their heads turning toward the trees where the coyotes had been. But Duke wasn't worried. The coyotes may have been cunning, but Duke was smarter, and he knew this land better than any predator ever could. The sun continued to rise, casting a warm glow over the pasture. The morning air was calm, but Duke's instincts told him that danger was never far away. He had to stay alert. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. He paced back and forth along the perimeter of the pen, his eyes scanning the trees. Every now and then he would stop, lifting his head to listen for the faintest sounds, footsteps, a rustle, anything that might signal the coyote's return. The day wore on, and Duke remained vigilant. The coyotes had been quiet, but that didn't mean they were gone. He had seen their numbers last night. They were more than just a few. This pack was hungry, and they would not give up easily. As the sun began to set once again, Duke's body ached with exhaustion. The night would be long, and the coyotes would likely return under the cover of darkness. But Duke would be ready. He always was. He took his place by the pen once more, his back to the flock. His eyes never strayed from the trees. The moon was rising in the distance, and Duke knew that tonight would be no different. The coyotes would come again, and he would be there to stop them. The moon hung high over the farm, casting long shadows that stretched across the fields like fingers reaching out from the darkness. The wind had picked up, its gusts howling through the trees as it carried the cold bite of winter's last breath. Duke stood on the outskirts of the pen, his eyes narrowed, watching the horizon with an intensity that could have burned a hole through the night. His muscles were stiff from the long watch, but his instincts were sharp, honed by years of protecting this land and its animals. Tonight was going to be different. The coyotes had been quiet during the day, almost too quiet. Duke could feel the tension building in the air, like a storm about to break. His ears flicked at every sound, every movement, no matter how small. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and tonight they were telling him that the coyotes were near, closer than before. He paced the perimeter, his paws making soft impressions in the grass, his eyes flicking back and forth. His body was tense, his posture rigid, ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger. The sheep, unaware of the imminent threat, had settled in for the night, their quiet bleats filling the air. But Duke wasn't so easily fooled. Knew that the coyotes would wait for the perfect moment, and that moment was approaching fast. The first sign came with a slight rustling in the trees, a soft crunch of leaves beneath paws. It was barely noticeable, but Duke caught it, his ears pricking up. He stopped, his body freezing as he listened more closely. The sound came again, closer this time. Duke's heart rate quickened, but he didn't move. He had learned that patience was just as important as strength when facing off against the pack. Coyotes were clever, calculating. They didn't attack recklessly. They waited for an opportunity, an opening, and Duke knew that. He had to be the one to make sure they never found it. The rustling grew louder, more distinct. There were more of them this time. At least 3, maybe more. Duke's hackles rose as the scent of the pack so reached his nose. They were close. He could almost taste their hunger in the air. But he stood his ground, unyielding. From the trees, a single coyote emerged, followed by the others, their eyes glowing in the moonlight. They moved with quiet precision, their bodies sleek and low to the ground, their noses working the air. Duke stood between them and the sheep, the distance between them growing smaller with every heartbeat. The coyotes stopped at the edge of the pasture, sizing up Duke with wary eyes. They knew he was not to be underestimated. He had proved himself, time and time again, and they had learned that attacking him head-on would only result in failure. But tonight, they were hungry, desperate even, and desperation often made creatures bold. Duke growled low in his throat, a rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very air around him. His teeth glinted in the moonlight as he took a step forward, positioning himself between the coyotes and the sheep. He would not let them get any closer. Not tonight. The lead coyote, a larger one with a scar running down its side, stepped forward. It was the one that had tested Duke earlier that morning. Its eyes narrowed, calculating its next move. Duke remained still, his body coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action at a moment's notice. The coyote's lips curled back in a snarl, and it took a step toward Duke. The others followed its lead, their movements synchronized. Duke let out a sharp bark, his voice echoing through the night like a warning shot. The coyotes hesitated for just a moment, their eyes flicking from Duke to the sheep behind him. It was all the opening Duke needed. With a growl, Duke lunged forward, his body a blur of motion. He was faster than the coyote had anticipated, and, before it could react, Duke was on it, his teeth sinking into its flank. The coyote yelped in surprise, its body twisting as it tried to break free. But Duke was relentless, his jaws locked firmly onto its side. The others hesitated, unsure of how to respond to Duke's sudden attack. They hadn't expected him to be so quick, so fierce. But they were predators, and they were hungry. They would not back down easily. One of the coyotes, a smaller one, darted toward the flock, hoping to find an opening while Duke was distracted. But Duke's instincts were sharp. He released the first coyote with a snarl and spun toward the second, intercepting it mid-stride. The smaller coyote yelped as Duke slammed into it, sending it crashing to the ground. The remaining coyotes growled, their eyes flashing with determination. They weren't going to give up so easily. With a coordinated effort, they pounced, all at once, their teeth flashing in the moonlight. Duke stood his ground, fighting with everything he had. His teeth met flesh, his claws dug into the earth as he fought back, with every ounce of strength. His body ached, his muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The sheep's lives depended on him. The battle raged, on under the cover of night, the coyotes circling, trying to find a weakness. But Duke was too strong, too fast. He was the protector, the guardian of the flock, and he would never allow harm to come to them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the coyotes began to retreat. One by one, they backed off, their tails between their legs. The pack had underestimated Duke, and now they realized they were not dealing with an ordinary farm dog. They were dealing with a protector, a warrior who would fight to the very end to keep his flock safe. As the last of the coyotes disappeared into the trees, Duke stood tall, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His body was bruised and battered, but his spirit was unbroken. The sheep, still huddled in their pen, were safe, for now. Duke lowered his head, his breath steadying. The danger had passed, and for tonight at least, the farm was secure. But Duke knew this wouldn't be the last time he would face the coyotes. They would come again, drawn by hunger and desperation. And when they did, Duke would be ready, always would be. The morning after the battle was eerily calm. Duke stood in the middle of the pasture, his eyes scanning the horizon as he did every morning. His body still ached from the fight, but he could feel the quiet peace settling over the land. The coyotes had retreated, and for now, the flock was safe. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the fields. It was a peaceful morning, one that seemed to say that the worst had passed. The sheep, still shaken from the night's events, grazed warily near the pen. They moved slowly, almost as though they were waiting for something, waiting for the storm to return. They had felt the presence of the coyotes, sensed their hunger, and now they were nervous, their heads swiveling every few moments to keep an eye on Duke, as if unsure whether they could relax Duke, however, knew better. The danger wasn't over. He had fought off the pack last night, but that was just one battle in a long war. Coyotes didn't give up easily. They would come again, and this time, Duke wasn't sure he could do it alone. The thought of that, of failing the flock, gnawed at him. He had always been the protector. It was his job to guard them, to keep them safe no matter what. And if he couldn't do that... He shook off the dark thoughts. Now wasn't the time to worry. Now was the time to prepare. As the day wore on, Duke kept his watch. His eyes never left the woods at the edge of the pasture, where the coyotes had come from the night before. He could feel the tension in the air, the stillness before the next attack. He paced along the perimeter, checking every nook and cranny, his sharp eyes catching every movement, no matter how small. But the coyotes didn't appear that day. They didn't come during the twilight hours or under the cover of darkness. Instead, the night passed in silence, a strange and unfamiliar quiet. It was almost as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Duke rested for a few hours, lying low in the tall grass at the edge of the pasture. His body was sore, but he had learned the value of rest. He couldn't protect the flock if he was too tired to fight. He closed his eyes briefly, but his mind was never fully at ease. Even with the calm around him, he could feel it, deep down in his bones. The coyotes were still out there. They were watching, waiting for the right moment. And when that moment came, Duke would be ready. He always was. The next few days passed uneventfully, and for the first time in a long while, Duke allowed himself to breathe easy. The days were warm, and the sheep seemed to settle back into their routine, grazing peacefully. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, and even the wind seemed to calm, but Duke didn't let his guard down completely. Every night, he remained by the pen, eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The coyotes had not shown their faces again, but Duke knew that it was only a matter of time. They would return. He was certain of it. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a familiar scent reached Duke's nose. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His body went rigid, his ears flicking as he stood and turned toward the source of the scent. The coyotes were close. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved toward the flock. He could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, the knowledge that the safety of the sheep rested entirely on him. The sheep were huddling closer together, some of them bleating nervously. Duke moved in between them, positioning himself so that he was facing the trees. The first coyote appeared from the shadows, its sleek form emerging from the edge of the woods. Then another and another. The pack was back. Duke growled low in his throat, his hackles rising as he stepped forward, putting himself between the coyotes and the flock. He would not let them take another step closer. The coyotes stopped, their glowing eyes trained on Duke. There were more of them this time, at least 5. They had learned from their last encounter, and now they were ready. The coyote from the night before, the one with the scar, stepped forward, its body low to the ground, eyes locked on Duke's. Duke's body tensed, every muscle ready for the fight. This time, he would not hold back. He knew that if he didn't stop them here, the coyotes would return again and again, each time with more confidence, more hunger. He would not allow them to destroy everything he had fought for. The scarred coyote made the first move, lunging forward with lightning speed. Duke was ready. He sidestepped the attack and met the coyote head-on, teeth bared. They collided with a force that sent shockwaves through the ground. Duke's jaws clamped down, locking onto the coyote's leg as it tried to break free. The other coyotes moved in, attempting to flank Duke, but he fought back fiercely. He growled and snapped at them, keeping them at bay with quick, powerful strikes. His muscles screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let them win. One of the coyotes, a smaller one, managed to dart past him, heading straight for the flock. Duke's heart raced as he turned to intercept. But before he could reach it, one of the other coyotes lunged at him from the side. The two collided with a sickening thud, and Duke was sent sprawling to the ground. His vision blurred for a moment, but he quickly regained his footing, shaking off the disorientation. The coyotes were closing in, but Duke wouldn't let them take the sheep, not while he had breath in his body. He rose to his feet, a fierce growl emanating from his throat. This would be the final stand. The pack would not have another chance. He would give everything he had to keep them safe. With a roar, Duke charged forward, teeth bared and claws outstretched. The coyotes hesitated for a moment, unsure of his renewed strength, but it was enough. The lead coyote, the one with the scar, hesitated, then turned and began to retreat. The others followed, their tails tucked between their legs as they disappeared back into the darkness. Duke stood still, panting heavily as he watched them retreat. His body was battered and bruised, but he had won. The coyotes were gone, for now. He turned back toward the flock, who had remained huddled together in fear. Their bleats were soft, their bodies still trembling. Duke walked slowly toward them, his eyes softening. The fight was over, but the war had only just begun. As the night wore on and the wind began to die down, Duke took his place once again by the pen. His body ached, and his energy was nearly gone, but he knew he couldn't stop now. The coyotes would return. They always did. But Duke would be ready. The next few days were heavy with an unsettling stillness, the kind of quiet that made Duke's fur prickle along his spine. The coyotes had retreated into the woods, but Duke knew better than to think. They were gone for good. They would return. He could feel it in his bones. The sky, once clear and bright, had darkened with an early frost, and the wind had turned colder, biting at the earth with icy fingers. The sheep huddled closer together, their wool thick and matted against the chill. They were nervous, their instincts attuned to the dangerous presence that lingered in the air. Duke stood watch at the edge of the pasture, his eyes scanning the May horizon once again. His body was sore from the last fight, his muscles tight from the constant tension, but he didn't allow himself the luxury of rest. Not yet. Not when he knew the threat was still there, lurking in the shadows as the sun began to set. Painting the sky with shades of deep purple and orange, Duke could hear the faintest rustling in the trees. His ears flicked, and his nose twitched as the scent of the coyotes reached him. They were close. But this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the coyotes weren't the only threat. Duke's instincts kicked into high gear. He turned, his eyes locking on the dense line of trees at the edge of the pasture. The coyotes were out there, But there was something else, something he couldn't quite place. His heart began to race. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. Duke turned his head, his hackles rising instinctively. But it wasn't the coyotes. It was the farmer, Ben. Ben walked toward Duke, his boots crunching in the frost-covered grass. He had been working on the barn all day, and the lines of exhaustion were clear on his face. He had aged over the years, and Duke had noticed the changes, slower steps, a more tired expression, but Ben was still his constant companion. "Evening, boy," Ben said softly, his voice rough from the cold. He reached down to scratch behind Duke's ears, a gesture of comfort that Duke had grown used to over the years. Ben's presence was always a balm to his tense nerves, but tonight, even that familiar touch felt different, tinged with an unspoken worry. Duke gave a low, rumbling growl, warning Ben without words. He didn't have time for distractions tonight. The danger was real. Ben paused, his hand stilling on Duke's fur as he looked out over the pasture. He could see the tension in Duke's stance, the way his body was coiled tight, ready to spring into action. Ben had always known Duke's instincts were sharp, but tonight the dog seemed more on edge than usual. "Something out there?" Ben asked, quietly, his voice cautious. Duke nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving the trees. Ben frowned. "Coyotes again, huh?" Duke's lips curled back in a snarl, his eyes flicking toward the woods. There was more than just coyotes out there. He could sense it. Something old, something deep within the land, was stirring. Ben sighed and stood up straighter, brushing the frost off his jacket. He knew Duke too well. The dog didn't show fear. He never had. But there was something about tonight that felt different, more dangerous than the attacks they had endured in the past. "All right, boy," Ben murmured, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. "I'll stay out here with you tonight. We'll face whatever comes." Duke glanced at him, then back at the trees. The farmer's presence, while a comfort, couldn't keep the coyotes away, but he understood Ben's need to be close, to be part of the protection. Duke had grown to appreciate the companionship they shared, the way Ben always seemed to understand what the dog needed, though they both knew that the real work would fall on Duke's shoulders. The minutes dragged on, the night growing colder, the sky darkening more as the stars began to emerge one by one. Ben set up a lantern near the fence line and positioned himself against the barn to stay warm, his gaze flickering from Duke to the trees. He kept a careful watch, but Duke knew it wasn't the coyotes that had his attention. The wind carried, the faintest sound, barely a whisper. It was distant, but clear. The coyotes were moving in. Duke's muscles tensed as he looked at Ben. The farmer nodded, understanding the silent command. Duke moved to the edge of the pasture, pacing slowly, every step calculated. The coyotes were there, just beyond the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly the rustling in the trees grew louder, and Duke's instincts flared to life. The coyotes had arrived, but there was something different about their approach. There was no stealth, no careful plotting. They were charging, almost as if they were being driven by something or someone. Duke's heart raced. The pack was closer than ever, but it wasn't the pack that frightened him. It was the feeling that hung in the air, the sense that something, older and more sinister, was lurking just out of sight. He could feel it deep in his bones. A shadow moved at the edge of the woods, and Duke's ears perked. He let out a low, warning growl. and then he saw it. A figure, almost human in shape, but shrouded in the mist of the night. The coyotes stopped, their eyes wide with fear as the figure emerged from the darkness. Duke didn't need to see it clearly to know what it was. He had heard the stories, the old legends passed down from one farmer to the next, of creatures that roamed the land, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. The coyotes had been driven here, but now they were just pawns in a much older game. Ben, sensing the danger, stood up quickly, his eyes darting between Duke and the figure. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Duke didn't answer. There was no time for words. He lunged forward, the coyotes scattering as the shadow moved closer, its form becoming more defined. The scent in the air grew heavier, darker, and Duke's heart pounded in his chest. This was no ordinary threat. The coyotes had been a warning. The shadow loomed larger, and the night seemed to grow colder still. The battle was just beginning. Duke's breath came in sharp bursts as he stood frozen, his eyes locked on the shadow at the edge of the trees. The coyotes had scattered, as if sensing what he could feel, an ancient, looming presence that was far more terrifying than anything they had ever encountered. This wasn't just about protecting the flock anymore. It was about survival against something older than the land itself. The figure remained motionless at the edge of the trees, shifting darkness that seemed to consume the moonlight. It wasn't quite human, nor was it a coyote, though its form seemed to borrow traits from both. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, were the only part of it that was clear, and they seemed to pierce into Duke's very soul. The coyotes, usually so bold in their attacks, were now cowering, retreating into the shadows as if they recognized the power of this figure. Even they feared it. Ben, standing near the barn, had seen enough. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the lantern, the flickering light casting long, jittery shadows across the pasture. "Duke," he called softly, his voice strained. "What is it? What do we do?" Duke's body remained taut, his legs ready to spring into action at the first sign of aggression. But his instincts told him that this wasn't a fight to be won with speed or strength alone. This was something different, something that transcended the battles of the past. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't interested in the flock. It was interested in Duke. The figure took a slow step forward, its movements impossibly fluid, as though it wasn't bound by the laws of nature. Duke growled low in his throat, the hairs along his back standing on end. The air around them grew thicker, colder, and the ground seemed to shudder beneath his paws. "Ben," Duke thought, but couldn't say. "Stay back." There was no point in putting the farmer at risk. The figure didn't seem interested in Ben at all. Its gaze was fixed solely on Duke. A deep guttural growl rumbled from within the figure's chest, echoing across the pasture. It-yimu was a sound that made the hairs on Duke's neck prickle, and his heart pound in his chest. It wasn't a challenge. It was a warning that Duke didn't intend to heed. With a sudden burst of movement, the figure lunged, its long limbs extending toward Duke. But he was ready. With a powerful leap, Duke dodged the attack, rolling to the side and landing on all fours. His muscles burned with the effort, but his focus never wavered. The figure hissed, its eyes narrowing, and then it seemed to vanish into the mist, reappearing behind Duke with unnatural speed. Duke spun around just in time to avoid another strike, the shadow's claws grazing his shoulder. He winced at the sharpness of the touch, but the pain only fueled his resolve. He barked furiously, alerting the sheep. "Stay back, stay safe," he thought, though his voice was lost to the winds. The flock huddled closer together, their bleats frantic and anxious. They trusted Duke, but in this moment he could feel their fear. They could sense the power of the ancient threat and knew, deep down, that their protector was facing something far beyond the usual dangers. Duke's gaze darted back to Ben, who was still standing by the barn, frozen in place. Ben wasn't a fighter. He never had been. But Duke knew that the farmer had his own role to play. His presence was important. It kept the sheep calm. It kept Duke grounded. For now, that was enough. The figure stalked closer, moving as though the darkness itself was part of its being. The air seemed to thrum with energy, and Duke's senses were on high alert. He could feel the weight of this confrontation deep within him. The battle was no longer just a matter of physical strength, but something more primal. This was a clash of wills, and Duke wasn't about to lose. With a sharp, forceful growl, Duke lunged again, his teeth snapping through the air as he aimed for the shadowy form. The figure moved swiftly, but not quickly enough to escape Duke's bite. His teeth sank into the dark shape, a moment of triumph. But then something shifted. The darkness seemed to pulse and swirl, and the figure's form expanded, growing taller and more imposing. Duke's teeth clamped down harder, but the shadow's substance seemed to shift and stretch, twisting like smoke around his jaws. Duke's heart raced as he tried to hold on to his grip, but the more he struggled, the more the figure's form seemed to slip through his grasp, its edges blurring and reforming. The shadow let out another low growl, but this time it wasn't directed at Duke. The sound reverberated through the ground, shaking the earth beneath them. The coyotes, still hiding in the shadows, began to howl in response, their voices joining in a chorus of eerie, mournful cries. Duke's head swiveled as he saw the pack emerge from the trees once more. They were circling, but they were not attacking. No, this time it was as if they were following the figure's lead, waiting for its command. Duke growled again, his body trembling with effort. But he didn't let go. This time, he had to finish what he started. The coyotes weren't the real threat. They were merely the followers of something much darker. Suddenly the shadow pulled back, retreating with an unnatural speed. It disappeared into the mist, leaving Duke standing alone in the pasture. His body was bloodied and bruised, but he was still standing. Ben moved toward him slowly, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. What in the world was that? Duke lowered his head, panting heavily, but his gaze never left the trees. The coyotes were gone now, slinking back into the woods, but the figure, whatever it was, had retreated as well. Duke didn't know what it had wanted, but he knew that it would return, and when it did, he would be ready. The battle was far from over. The night passed slowly, the kind of night where every sound seems amplified, and every shadow could hold a threat. Duke stayed, vigilant, his eyes scanning the darkness, his ears twitching at the slightest noise. The coyotes had disappeared into the woods, but the oppressive feeling of the unknown still lingered, thick in the air. Ben had returned to the house, but he had left the lantern near the barn, its flickering light the only source of warmth in the cold night. The sheep, though unsettled, had calmed somewhat. They huddled together in a tight cluster, their bleating quieted by the constant vigilance of their protector. Duke, however, was restless. The battle from earlier had drained him, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that weighed most heavily on him. It was the uncertainty. He had faced the coyotes before. He had faced dangers before. But this felt different. There was something ancient, something darker lurking in the woods, something that had used the coyotes as mere pawns. As the hours passed, the sky shifted from a deep blue to an inky black, with only the pale light of the stars to guide his watch. Duke's muscles ached, but he didn't allow himself to rest. He couldn't afford to. A distant howl pierced the air, and Duke's ears snapped forward, his body going rigid. It wasn't a coyote's howl. It was something else, something that chilled him to the bone. It was a mournful cry, echoing through the hills like the wail of something lost. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe for a moment, trying to place the sound. It wasn't like the other coyotes. It was closer to a wolf's howl, but deeper, older, carrying an edge of something supernatural. A long, drawn-out scream that seemed to be calling to something or someone. Duke's instincts flared. The coyotes hadn't come from the forest just to attack. No, there was a reason. Something had driven them here, driven them to him, and it wasn't just the hunt. He turned his head, looking toward the farmhouse where Ben had gone to sleep. The farmer had no idea what was coming, what he had been pulled into. Ben had trusted Duke to protect the flock, and Duke had never failed him before. But tonight, Duke wasn't sure if he could. The coyotes had never been his true adversary. They were merely the heralds of a much greater danger, something that had awakened in the dark corners of the land. And Duke couldn't shake the feeling that the time for hiding was over. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the pasture, sending the trees rustling and the sheep huddling even closer together. Duke's ears perked, listening for any hint of movement in the darkness. The coyotes were near, but he could feel something else, a presence, watching from the edge of the woods. Without warning, the wind shifted, carrying a new scent with it, a sharp, acrid odor that burned Duke's nostrils. He stiffened, his gaze darting toward the tree line. The air had grown thick with tension, the kind of oppressive silence that preceded a storm. Then in the distance he saw it, a flicker of movement, too quick to be a coyote. It was larger, its shape indistinct in the darkness, but it was there, moving steadily toward the flock. Duke's heart skipped a beat. There was no time to waste. He barked once, a sharp command that echoed through the pasture, and then bounded forward, his paws hitting the cold earth with a rhythmic beat. The sheep bleated in response, their panic rising as the danger neared. The shape in the trees moved. Again, closer this time, and Duke could hear the unmistakable sound of claws scraping the ground. It was not a coyote. It was something else. Duke's muscles coiled, ready for the fight of his life. As he reached the edge of the pasture, the figure stepped into view, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It was a creature unlike any Duke had ever seen, tall and hunched, with the body of a wolf but the face of something far older, something that had never seen the light of day. Its fur was ragged and matted, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. The scent that filled the air was the same as before, the same scent that had followed the coyotes. The creature's lips curled back in a snarl, revealing teeth far longer and sharper than any wolf's. Its growl rumbled from deep within its chest, shaking the ground beneath Duke's paws. Duke didn't hesitate. He launched himself at the creature, his jaws snapping with deadly precision. The beast swiped at him with long claws, narrowly missing his side, and then lunged again, its weight knocking Duke off balance. He hit the ground with a thud, his vision spinning. But he didn't let the creature's momentary advantage scare him. He was on his feet in an instant, growling fiercely as he circled the creature. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto his, and Duke could feel the hatred radiating from it. This wasn't just a battle for the sheep. This was something personal, something deeper. The creature's growl rose in pitch, and it lunged again, this time aiming for Duke's throat. But Duke was faster. With a swift sidestep, he ducked under the creature's attack, his teeth sinking into its flank. The beast howled in pain, and Duke twisted, driving his jaws deeper. But the creature wasn't finished. It threw Duke off with a violent jerk, sending him crashing into the snow. Duke struggled to rise, his body heavy with fatigue, but he refused to give in. The wind howled, and the night seemed to stretch on forever. The creature was relentless, its attacks coming faster, sharper. Duke's body was bruised and battered, but his spirit never faltered. Then through the trees, a second howl echoed, a coyote's call. The pack had returned. Duke's eyes flashed with determination. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was his moment to prove that he was more than just a farm dog. He was the protector of this land, and he would not let it fall to darkness. With a final furious growl, Duke lunged at the creature once more. He wouldn't stop until it was gone. The cold air felt like needles on Duke's fur as he sprinted forward, his legs pumping with all the strength he could muster. The fight was far from over, but he could feel it. He was reaching the end of his strength. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, but his resolve burned brighter than the exhaustion. The creature, towering and monstrous, was snarling as it circled him, its eyes glowing like embers in the night. Its body rippled with unnatural strength, and every time Duke made a move, the creature was there, anticipating him, always one step ahead. Behind him, the flock huddled together, vulnerable, their bleats a distant echo of the terror that gripped the pasture. He couldn't let them see this. He couldn't let the creatures have them. The coyotes had already attacked once, but this was different. This was something ancient, something rooted in the land itself. And Duke knew that he had to end it tonight. He growled low, a warning to the beast that he would not back down. The creature's lips curled back in a sneer, as though mocking his defiance. It lashed out with its claws again, its movements too fast for Duke to fully track. One of the claws raked his shoulder, leaving a long, burning gash. Pain flared through his body. But Duke didn't flinch. He fought through it, charging the creature once more. His jaws found their mark, sinking into the beast's flesh with a savage growl. The creature howled in pain, its claws swiping at Duke in retaliation. But Duke wasn't finished. He refused to be. His grip tightened, and for a fleeting moment, the creature stumbled backward. Duke took that moment to retreat, though the movement was sluggish, his legs heavy with fatigue. He needed a plan. He needed a way to finish this once and for all. In the distance, the coyotes had gathered, a pack of hungry eyes watching from the shadows. They circled warily, as though waiting for the right moment to strike. But Duke knew something they didn't. They were just a distraction. The real threat was here, in front of him. The creature snarled, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fury. It was growing more aggressive, more desperate. Duke could feel the air shifting around him, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a storm on the horizon. He had to be quick. He had to end this. With a sudden burst of energy, Duke charged again, this time aiming for the creature's neck. The beast snarled, its claws reaching for him, but Duke was faster. His teeth sank into its throat with a final, forceful snap. Creature's body convulsed, its limbs flailing in a futile attempt to break free. But Duke held on. He felt the warmth of its blood flood his mouth as the beast let out a final, guttural scream. And then, with one last effort, the creature collapsed into the snow, its glowing eyes dimming, its body going limp. Duke stood over it, panting heavily, his body trembling from the exertion. His shoulder throbbed, but he couldn't afford to stop. The coyotes were still out there, still circling, and he couldn't let them think the fight was over. He looked up at the pack, his gaze unwavering. They hesitated for only a moment, their eyes flicking nervously to their fallen leader. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, the coyotes surged forward, howling as they charged. Duke's instincts kicked in. He was on the move in an instant, his body coiling with energy as he took the fight to them. His teeth flashed, his growl a deep, primal warning to the pack. They were no match for him, not now. The terror they had brought with them was nothing compared to the fury of a dog protecting his home. He dove into the pack, biting and snapping with deadly precision, forcing the coyotes back one by one. They retreated, their howls of pain mixing with the sound of their claws scraping across the frozen earth. Duke didn't relent. His body moved, with a grace he didn't know he still had, each movement calculated, each strike bringing him closer to his goal. The coyotes, realizing they were outmatched, began to scatter, retreating into the shadows from which they had come. But Duke wasn't done, not yet. He stood in the center of the pasture, his head held high, his body still tense with the adrenaline of the fight. The air was thick with the scent of blood, the cold wind carrying away the last echoes of the battle. The coyotes were gone, and the creature, whatever it had been, lay motionless in the snow. But Duke knew this peace would not last. The land had shifted, and things older than any of them had awakened. It wasn't just about protecting the flock anymore. It was about standing against the darkness that threatened to consume everything. The weight of that responsibility settled on Duke's shoulders. But he didn't falter. He was a protector. That was his purpose, his calling, and he would fight to the end to see it fulfilled. Slowly he turned toward the barn, where Ben was standing, watching from the door. His eyes were wide with awe, disbelief, and something else. Fear, perhaps, but also a deep gratitude. The man had seen the fight. He had witnessed Duke's courage, and Duke could sense the bond between them growing stronger. Ben didn't need to say anything. The unspoken words between them were enough. The battle had ended, but the night was far from over. The wind had picked up again, the snow swirling in the darkness, but Duke was ready. The land would need him again, and he would be there. The moon was low in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows across the pasture. Duke stood at the edge of the field, watching as the first light of dawn slowly began to push the darkness away. The wind had died down, and the cold had settled into a quiet stillness that felt almost unnatural, after the chaos of the night. He was exhausted, every muscle in his body aching from the battle. His shoulders still throbbed, the wound raw and tender, but it didn't matter. He had done his job. The flock was safe. The coyotes had been driven off, and the creature, the thing that had threatened everything Duke had sworn to protect, was gone. Behind him, the barn door creaked open, and Ben stepped out into the chilly morning air. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but there was a look of relief in his gaze as he took in the quiet that had settled over the land. Duke turned to face him, his gaze steady, unwavering. He didn't need words. Ben knew. They both knew what had happened, and they both knew that the fight was far from over. The land had changed. Something had awakened in the darkness, and it wouldn't be long before it came again. But for now, there was peace. Ben walked slowly toward him, his steps careful, as though unsure of what to say. When he reached Duke, he crouched down, his hand reaching out to gently pat the dog's head. Duke leaned into the touch, his tired body relaxing at the simple act of comfort. "You did good, boy," Ben said, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "You did more than good." Duke's tail gave a weak wag, a small gesture, but it was enough. He was tired, yes, but the bond between him and Ben had deepened beyond what words could express. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was family. Ben stood up and looked out at the pasture, his gaze lingering on the area where the coyotes had once gathered. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm golden glow over the land. It was a new day. The world felt different, somehow, still and quiet, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Duke's ears perked as he heard the distant bleating of the sheep, still huddled together in the far corner of the field. They were safe, and that was all that mattered. The flock would thrive. He had made sure of it. Ben turned back to Duke, his face softening. "We've got work to do, boy," he said, more to himself than to the dog, "but we'll take it slow. We'll figure it out." Duke gave a soft bark in response, as if to say, "I'm with you, always." The first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The world, though scarred by the events of the night, was waking up to a new beginning, and so Duke stood, side by side, with the man who had become his family, knowing that together they could face whatever lay ahead. The coyote pack had been driven away, the ancient threat vanquished for now, but the land was vast, and the shadows were long. Duke knew there would always be more to protect, more to defend. His duty was far from finished. He looked up at Ben, the man who had given him a second chance at life, and he knew that as long as they stood together, they would be ready for whatever came next. The world was quiet, the day still fresh with promise. And in that moment, Duke felt peace, a peace earned through loyalty, through courage, through a bond that could never be broken. For Duke, the protector, the fight was never over. But for now, he could rest. His family was safe, and the land, though darkened by the shadows of the night, was waiting for the light of a new dawn.